Shia Labeouf is back with a highly anticipated movie about Padre Pio. You know, the same actor from... Shia had some controversy before this project after allegations of abuse, but Christian audiences have still been interested in this film. After all, Padre Pio is one of the most popular saints of the 20th century, and this film was the trigger for Shia Labeouf's conversion to Catholicism, a conversion that has quite a powerful story behind it, which is well laid out in an interview with Bishop Barron that I'd highly recommend you watch. The question on everyone's mind was whether Shia could pull off the role of Padre Pio and give this saint the respect he deserves. If he failed, people would be let down. Well, I got good news and bad news. The good news is I think Shia did a fantastic job of playing Pio. The bad news? It didn't matter because this film wasn't even about Pio. There's a fatal flaw in this movie and its disconnect between Pio's story and the political story of San Giovanni that the director is much more interested in talking about. Of course, this film doesn't have to be a biopic of Pio, but the connection between these two subplots was at best messy and at worst borderline offensive. I'm going to unpack Shia's performance, how this plot disconnection damaged the potential of his performance, and then explain how despite all of this, in a weird way, I'm still super thrilled that this film was made. Does my opinion sound all over the place? Don't worry, so is this film. First, some background on Padre Pio for all you pagans out there. Padre Pio was a Capuchin friar, a holy order in the Catholic Church inspired by St. Francis of Assisi. The Capuchin friars are dedicated to living a life of poverty, simplicity, and missionary work among the poor. He was especially known for his work in confessions. In Catholic faith, it's important to confess your sins to a priest for the absolution of your sins. This practice is not only beneficial for your soul, but it's a powerful way to be honest with one's flaws and improve as a person. There are countless stories of Padre Pio literally bringing up people's sins without them even mentioning it to him, almost like he could read their minds and expose what they were hiding. If you take a look at some of the written accounts of his time in confession, which I've linked down below, you'd be amazed at the things this man has done. He's also known for bearing the stigmata, the wounds of Christ on the hands, feet, and side. The stigmata has shown up on a handful of saints throughout history, and it's a sign of holiness and an alignment of a person suffering with Jesus. This film documents Padre Pio's beginnings in San Giovanni, Italy, and the lead up to him eventually bearing the stigmata. Considering how big a deal Padre Pio is for so many people in the Catholic Church, the expectation for Shia to pull off a good performance was high. As Shia Labeouf himself said,
"One of the most respected, beloved saints that ever graced the earth. Some people in Italy don't carry a Jesus on them, they carry a Pio on them."
Yeah, right.
You go to certain places in Italy and he's everywhere. He's Elvis. And I mean that in the best way.
if you wanted to know how Shia Labeouf did in playing Padre Pio, I would honestly say he did a pretty good job for the screen time he had. It's clear he took this part very seriously and made a real effort to understand both Padre Pio as a person and the Catholic liturgy. There's two quick things I'd outline he did a great job at. First, the sacraments. Confession and the Holy Eucharist are incredibly important to Padre Pio's life. When you see Padre Pio say Mass in the movie, Shia doesn't treat it like some random side action his character has to do. Instead, there's a valiant effort by the actor to treat it with reverence and respect. He tries to get each step of the Mass right, as well as an authentic reaction to those steps that mirror the passion Padre Pio would have when saying Mass. For the confession scene, you also see Padre Pio's determination for people to be contrite and willing to actually grow away from their sins, as well as his disdain for people who don't take the process seriously. There's some controversy surrounding the decision to have Padre Pio swear, which in my opinion was probably a move that wasn't necessary by the director. The anger in Pio was already clear in Shia's performance, and there's no need to alienate some of the audience by adding an F-bomb in. Nevertheless, Shia did a good job at treating Catholic sacraments seriously, which isn't always the case for actors playing the parts of priests. The only other big controversy surrounding his acting was his choice not to use an Italian accent. But I mean, Chris Pratt did the same thing with Mario, and let's be real, do we really want to see Shia Labeouf running around being like, I'm a Padre Pio? Okay, sorry about that. The second thing Shia did a good job of portraying is Padre Pio's internal struggle. Padre Pio was known for being tormented by the evil one, and this film had a pretty unique way of portraying it. Rather than making the devil some creature that looks like an alien, the directors instead used an older man who would poke at Pio's insecurities and try to demoralize him. Pio's response was what you would expect from him, which was both suffering the pains of this demoralization while also refusing to put up with it and fighting back through prayer and even physical fist fighting. We also see a good discussion of the dry spots in Pio's personal prayer life and how he would try to move through it to serve the Lord the best he could. With these elements, Pio's character was set up for success. All the movie needed to do was incorporate these parts of the film into a coherent story that showed his development up to the stigmata. And from there, this film would be both a beautiful commemoration of Pio and also a tie-in into 20th century Italian politics. Unfortunately, the film didn't do that, like at all. When I was watching the trailers and film footage being released before this film came out, I was a bit confused about all the clips of soldiers and Italian revolutionaries, but I trusted that this film would be woven into Pio's story and that these political takes would give an interesting element for Pio's character to play off of. But as I saw the movie in theaters, I waited for there to be some connection, and it never came. You see, the big focus of this movie is not on Pio, but on the 1920 police massacre of peasants in San Giovanni after their Socialist Party won the election. The film portrays an evolving but broken plot of peasants coming back from World War I, and many reverting to communist and socialist movements in the face of the injustice they suffered. The plot details how a movement was formed by a group of radicals, alongside the widows of Italian soldiers, and their efforts together to push back against the ruling party. I think there'd be some overlap between Padre Pio and this random part of the story. After all, this movie is called Padre Pio, not an Italian revolution and stuff, but oh look, there's also Padre Pio praying in a window. But there literally was no connection, like at all. There was little to no interaction between the characters of the political plot and Padre Pio's plot. Pio's problems were exclusively internal, with no connection to the church or other friars. On the flip side, the conflict in the political part of the film doesn't touch on the role of the church nearly enough. You see one guy who lost his son in the war go to Pio for guidance, and then is suddenly shown later being encouraged to vote for the Socialist Party. It makes you wonder why this political conflict is in the film in the first place. Or maybe why Pio is in this film, because he's kind of sidetracking from the focus that the director clearly seemed to have more interest in exploring, which was the socialist movement in Italy's devolution to fascism, a theme that the director compares to January 6th for some reason. I think the film could have bridged the gap properly if they had created a character that was caught between Pio's world and the world of political conflict. Maybe a character who was torn on whether to seek healing and redemption from the church or from the political movements that would upend the church. That could lead to some interesting discussion about how people live with the trauma of war and injustice. This could only be done if Pio's story had a sliver of tangential connection to the political conflict, which it didn't. Instead, the connection is meant to be symbolic. The film gives a side-by-side story of Pio getting the stigmata and using that as a comparison of the sacrifices the peasants made in the socialist revolution against fascism, an approach that will probably offend Catholics and communists alike. Let me explain. The massacre of San Giovanni was tragic. The film treats the peasant rebels as heroes and the ruling party as villains. This is expected, as the ruling party eventually gave way to fascism within Italy historically. The problem is it's hard to treat both Pio and the socialists as one and the same, as the film also laments the church, showing a priest blessing the weapons used for the firing squad that would later kill off the main characters in the story. All of this is done to show how the sacrifices and struggles of the peasants is similar to Pio's sacrifices on the way to getting stigmata. But there's one glaring problem. Pio might not like the fascists, but he certainly isn't comparable to communists either. Historically, Padre Pio used his platform to denounce Marxism and communism. The Communist Party would later blame Pio for 2 defeats in their elections in the 40s. This take by Pio is expected, as the church's consistent criticism of communism is that the ideology is not rooted in love for the poor, but rather a resentment towards the rich that manifests in violence and a constant thirst for power, which explains why the 20th century was riddled with communist uprisings that gave way to totalitarianism and mass murder much worse than the governments they toppled ever could try to create. It's therefore a stretch to try to parallel Padre Pio's story of stigmata with the peasant uprising, because although the peasant enemies were certainly evil fascists, there is a fundamental disconnect between the two stories. The stigmata is a spiritual struggle, and the massacre is an atheist political struggle. The Christian teaching is that human liberation from suffering doesn't come from political revolutions and balance of power shifts. Rather, like Pio, it comes from internal transformation of the individual by aligning oneself with Christ. And through that, someone becomes capable of enacting change from a position of love rather than bitterness and vengeance. Pio's story is of a man who rejected the search for happiness and truth in the outside world, and instead suffered internally for the sake of a higher spiritual goal. The political moments, however valiant they might have been, rejected the premises of religion, and instead see the world through institutional injustice rather than tackling the human evil and sin that undergirds it. It's a botched parallel. And even if you don't think it's a botched parallel, the movie itself reveals the futility of trying to compare these two stories. When the movie was finished, I kid you not, I heard a loud "that's it" from the crowd. The The reason I think the crowd said it is because the story failed to bridge the gap between the political and the spiritual, leaving the Padre Pio story and the political story feeling incomplete and ambiguous. I'm mixed about this film. I think the director wasted a lot of potential to see Padre Pio's story shine because of the political subplot. And with Shia's hard work preparing for the role, the fans were expecting his character to have more screen time and plot relevance than he got. I'm not going to make this video to badmouth the director. Instead, I think it's just a problem of trying to juggle two stories at once and keeping the comparisons only symbolic. It left the audience confused and wishing for more, especially for more Pio, which everyone came to the theaters and paid to see. With all my trash talk being said, I'm still thrilled this film was made, but for completely different reasons than you'd expect. As I look back on what drew me to see this film, Shia's personal conversion to Christianity, I realized that whether this film flops or flies to the top really doesn't matter. The real winner is not the audience or the producers, but Shia himself. You see, as someone who converted to Catholicism and was confirmed this year, I found a lot of inspiration from Shia's story. He had made some pretty horrible decisions in his life and was on a path to self-destruction. But he credits this project for saving him. Say what you want about Shia and whether you support him after what he's done, but personally I prefer someone who is open, repentant, and authentic with their struggles over the 99% of other Hollywood actors who virtue signal and play the role of an activist, but deep down have plenty of problems themselves. Shia certainly had that phase of his life too, like the infamous "He Will Not Divide" Us stunt that led to some pretty hilarious trolling from 4chan. But as his own mistakes mounted on him, he started to show something you don't see a lot in his industry, which is humility and an honest effort to turn his life around. This film was a driving force behind that turning. As a Catholic, I see this film kind of as God's intervention for Shia. You know, interventions where addicts are told to go somewhere for a party or something fun, but realize it's actually their friends gathered around to tell them they need to get help. Here, Shia was lured into this project with a great casting opportunity by a promising director, as well as the chance to restart the career he cherished above all else. But as he prepared for the role and lived with real Capuchin friars in the monastery, what he got instead was a time of genuine introspection and spiritual conversion to set him on the right track. His obsession of over-preparing for his characters in his movies became the trigger for a personal wake-up call. Called to move away from the destructive habits and desires that ruined his life in the first place. Instead of going down that rabbit hole further by pursuing success and his craft, he found love and brotherhood in the friars that led to a deeper calling within him. Shia LaBeouf has always had weird spiritual revelations in the past, but I have hope for him this time. Compared to his previous stunts, he now has something he never had before, which is a real community of brothers that love him and can hold him accountable. His pride and personal ideas aren't the source of his worldview anymore. Instead, he's humbly relying on others for support and guidance. You don't see enough of that in this world. The people who helped him prepare for the role, the friars, are still in contact with him, and judging on the stories Shia has told about him, they seem like the kind of actually nice people who would want the best for him, regardless of his celebrity status. That way, it's arguably better that the film didn't meet my expectations. There's no ego Shia can gain from this film, and no accolades he can use as a springboard to re-enter the business of the Hollywood industry. This whole project was just a way for God to reveal himself, exclusively to Shia, and it doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks about it. It's up to you if you'd like to check out the movie, but if you're a Christian, consider saying a prayer for Shia. I'm rooting for him. His Capuchin brothers are too, and you don't need box office success to deserve that.